Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. I decided to go camping with my neighbor Bill, who used to be a police officer. He'd been in the police for over 30 years, and since he retired, he spent most of his time outside. I trusted him, figured he'd be the safest person to go camping with. So when he asked me to join him on this trip, I didn't think twice. We drove for a few hours to a spot Bill liked, way out in the woods. It was the kind of place where there was no one else around, just trees and quiet. We set up camp by a small river. The sound of the water rushing by made everything feel peaceful. That first day was perfect. We caught some fish, looked around the area a little, and by the time the sun went down, we had a fire going. Bill told stories about when he was a cop, but the more he talked, the more I noticed he had this serious side. He talked about how much he liked being away from everything, how it gave him a kind of peace he didn't get much of when he was working. The next morning, Bill wanted to hike deeper into the woods. I followed him. We went farther than I would have gone alone, but I trusted him, so I didn't worry too much. After a couple of hours, we came across this old path, almost hidden by plants and bushes. It didn't look like anyone had walked it in years. Bill glanced at me, and without saying a word, we both knew we were going to check it out. As we walked down the path, I started to feel uneasy. The trees seemed closer, the air felt heavier, and it was strangely quiet. Not even the birds were making noise. Bill didn't say much either. He just kept walking ahead, like he knew where he was going. But I had no idea where we were, and it was clear we were a long way from camp. After a while, we found something weird. Behind some thick bushes, there was this old cabin. It looked abandoned, like no one had been there for a very long time. The wood was falling apart, and the windows were broken. Bill walked right up to the door and pushed it open. It made this loud creak, and the sound went right through me. Inside, it looked like someone had stayed there once, but not recently. There were old food cans, a torn-up sleeping bag, and a few bits of trash on the floor. The whole place had this strange, unsettling feeling, like we weren't supposed to be there. Bill checked out the cabin, his eyes sharp, like he was back in cop mode. He was looking at everything, trying to figure out what was going on. After a few minutes, he stepped outside and looked around the woods, then back at me. He didn't have to say it. We both knew something was off, but he wasn't ready to leave yet. Just then, we heard a noise in the bushes nearby. My heart started pounding, but Bill didn't even blink. He motioned for us to quietly move away from the cabin. We didn't run, but we walked fast, keeping close together. The farther we got from the cabin, the more I felt like we were being watched. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something was out there, something that knew we were here. When we finally got back to our campsite, the sun was setting. The fire we had left burning was out, and everything felt too quiet, like the whole area had changed while we were gone. Bill was quieter than usual. He walked around our camp, checking everything to make sure nothing had been touched. I was on edge, feeling like we had crossed some invisible line, and now something was watching us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept thinking about that cabin and whatever might have been out there. Bill stayed awake, sitting by the fire with a flashlight, keeping an eye on the darkness around us. I could tell he felt it too. Something was wrong here. The next morning, without a word, Bill packed up his stuff and I did the same. We left earlier than planned, cutting the trip short. As we drove away, the tension started to lift, but I couldn't shake this feeling that we had barely escaped something. Bill didn't say much, but I knew he felt it too. I asked myself if I would have been this scared if I had gone alone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my fear. Bill, the guy who had seen it all, was shaken too. That's when it hit me. Not everything out in the woods can be understood or explained. Some things are just out there watching, waiting, and sometimes they don't want to be found. As we drove away, I kept thinking about the way Bill had scanned the woods before we left, how he didn't even want to talk about it afterward. We didn't just find an old cabin that day. We found something worse, something that still knew we were there, and I'm sure of it now, it followed us. It was supposed to be an easy camping trip. Just me, my business partner, his brother, and his brother's wife. We had all agreed on a quiet spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites. At first, it seemed perfect. No people, just the sound of the wind and leaves. We set up our tents, got the fire going, and sat down to relax. We were looking forward to a calm weekend, getting away from work. The first night was fine, but the next morning, things started to feel strange. I woke up early, the sun barely shining through the trees. My partner's brother was already awake, just staring out into the woods. He didn't move, didn't talk, just stood there like he was watching something far away that I couldn't see. His wife was still in their tent. She said she wasn't feeling well, and I figured it was just the stress of being out here in the middle of nowhere. By the afternoon, things got worse. The brother wasn't talking much, and his wife barely left the tent. My partner and I decided to go for a walk to shake off the uneasy feeling, but even the woods felt different. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving between the trees, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. When we got back to the campsite, the brother was pacing around, staring out at the trees again. He wouldn't eat, just kept moving back and forth, his eyes always looking into the woods like he was waiting for something. His wife stayed in the tent, not making a sound. It was like the air around us had changed, heavy with something I couldn't explain. My partner and I kept giving each other looks, like we both knew something was wrong, but neither of us wanted to say it. Later that night, I heard something. It was quiet at first, like a soft whisper on the wind, but it got louder. It wasn't clear what it was or where it was coming from, but it seemed to come from deep in the woods. My partner and I stayed by the fire, trying to act like nothing was happening, but I could tell we were both on edge. The brother stood up again, staring out into the trees, completely still. Around midnight, the brother's wife finally came out of the tent. She looked sick, her skin pale and her movements slow, like she hadn't slept in days. Without a word, she walked right past us and headed toward the trees. My partner and I watched her go, too shocked to move. She didn't stop, didn't turn around, just kept walking deeper into the woods until we couldn't see her anymore. The brother followed her soon after. He didn't say a word, didn't run, just walked in the same direction, disappearing into the darkness. My partner and I sat there by the fire, waiting for them to come back. But the hours passed and they never did. We stayed up all night, barely speaking, listening for any sound, any sign that they were coming back. By morning, it was clear they were gone. Their tent was still there, their gear untouched, but they had vanished. There were no footprints, no sign of where they had gone. It was like the forest had swallowed them whole. We packed up in silence, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. We left everything they owned behind, not wanting to stay in that place any longer than we had to. The walk back felt like it took forever. Every step I took, I felt like someone or something was watching us from just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows. We never found out what happened to them. No one did. And the strangest part is, the longer I stayed out of those woods, the more I felt like we had been lucky. Whatever took them could have taken us too. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I hear that same whisper, faint and far away. It's as if the woods aren't done with me yet, and something is still waiting for me to come back. I I worked as a border sergeant for years, and after a while, you get used to the weird stuff that comes with the job. Long patrols in empty areas, chasing people or things that shouldn't be there, and sometimes sleeping out in the middle of nowhere. But there's one night I can't seem to forget, no matter how much time has passed. One weekend, I decided to go camping near the border. It wasn't for work, just a chance to get some peace and quiet. The area was rough, with dry riverbeds, big rocks, and scattered bushes. It wasn't a place people normally went. I found a spot near some rocks, parked my truck, and set up camp. No one was around. I didn't expect to see anyone this far out. As the sun went down, the sky turned from bright orange to deep purple and then finally black. I started a small fire and sat beside it, watching the flames and listening to the quiet of the desert. A few coyotes howled in the distance, but that's normal out here. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that felt calming after long days of work. Around midnight, I heard something strange. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but not quite. It was a low humming noise, steady and unnatural. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day, but it didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. It wasn't a machine or a truck, and it wasn't the wind either. Something about it felt off, like it didn't belong in the middle of the desert. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around, first where I was sitting, then over by the rocks where I parked my truck. I didn't see anything. The humming grew louder, like it was coming from everywhere at once. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt a chill run down my back. That feeling you get when you know something isn't right. I walked further away from the fire, scanning the area with my flashlight, looking for whatever might be making that sound. And then I saw it, movement in the distance. Across the dry riverbed, there was something. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't another camper. It was a figure, tall and thin, moving slowly, like it had a purpose. I could barely make out its shape in the dark, but it wasn't moving like any person I'd ever seen. I crouched down, keeping low, and watched. My hand hovered over my gun, but I didn't take it out yet. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. The figure moved behind a ridge and disappeared from sight. As soon as it was gone, the humming stopped. Everything was quiet again, almost too quiet. I stayed still, listening, waiting, trying to convince myself that it was just a shadow or maybe my eyes playing tricks in the dark. Then I felt it, a faint rumble under my feet, like something moving deep underground. It wasn't strong, but it was there, like the earth was shifting. My heart started racing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. I've spent years out here, and I know the desert pretty well. This wasn't something I'd ever come across before. I hurried back to my camp. The humming started again, faint but constant. I didn't want to stay any longer. I threw my gear into the truck, stomped out the fire, and got out of there as fast as I could. As I drove down the empty road, I could still hear the sound, following me, staying close behind, like it was keeping pace with my truck. After a few miles, the noise stopped just like that, as if it had never been there at all. The next morning, I went back to my usual routine at the station, but I couldn't shake what had happened. Something about that night kept replaying in my mind. I told myself it might have been something underground, maybe some kind of tunnel system or old pipeline. Maybe it had something to do with the border crossings, but I wasn't sure. Whatever it was, I never went back to check. I didn't want to know what I might find out there. It's been years since that night, but even now, when I'm out in the desert, I sometimes stop and listen. I haven't heard the hum again, but I know it's still out there, waiting. I don't think it was ever meant to be found. And every once in a while, when I'm alone in those empty stretches of land, I can feel something beneath the ground, just out of reach, like it's still moving, waiting for the right moment to come back. I've always liked camping alone, especially in spots where I knew no one else would be for miles. The quiet of the woods has a way of clearing my head. So when I found a small, hidden place deep in the forest, far away from any trails, I knew it was perfect. I set up my tent at the edge of a little clearing where I could see the stars at night. The trees around me were tall and thick, blocking out most of the sunlight during the day. Only a few beams of light got through. At first, it felt calm. But as the sun started setting, I got this weird feeling in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but like something wasn't quite right. When the sky turned completely dark, the forest went dead quiet. Usually, you can hear the sound of leaves rustling, insects buzzing, or the crack of a branch breaking. But there was none of that, just silence. It felt like the whole forest had stopped, like it was waiting for something. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to walk around the camp, thinking it might help me relax. As I walked, I started noticing something strange. The trees looked different, like they had moved. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the deeper I went, the more I felt like the forest had changed. The clearing I set up and felt further away, like I was being pulled deeper into the woods without realizing it. I turned around, ready to head back to camp, but my flashlight flickered and went out. I smacked it a few times, hoping it would come back on, but it stayed dead. The dark swallowed everything around me. I knew I was close to camp, but without the light, I couldn't tell which way to go. Every tree I thought I recognized ended up being something else entirely. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, something big moving between the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was tall, way taller than any person. It didn't make a sound as it moved, just slipped through the trees like it belonged there. I stood still, hoping it would keep going and not see me, but it didn't. It stopped, turning in my direction, and I could make out its shape. It looked like a man, but its arms were too long, hanging down near the ground, and its head was tilted at a strange angle, like it was studying me from a distance. I started to back up slowly, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I was sure it could hear it. Every instinct told me to run, but I knew if I did, it would chase me. So, I kept moving slowly, step by step, trying to find my way back to camp. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could feel it watching me, following me. It stayed hidden in the shadows, but I knew it was there. After what felt like forever, I finally stumbled back into the clearing. My tent was still there, untouched, but the fire had gone out. I didn't even try to start it again. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything I could into it, and ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was far from that spot. I ran through the trees, branches snapping under my feet, and I didn't care about the noise anymore. My legs were on fire, and my lungs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept going. It felt like the forest was closing in on me. No end in sight, but I had to keep running. That thing was still out there. I could feel it behind me, moving closer. Finally, I burst through the tree line and onto an old logging road. I followed it until I saw my car. I jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and drove as fast as I could, not daring to look back. It's been a few days since then, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. Even at home, where I should feel safe, I get this creeping feeling that I'm not alone. I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, just outside my window, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. But last night, as I lay in bed, I swear I heard something outside my door, something scratching, faint but steady. I didn't dare get up to check. I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe again. I had planned a quiet weekend away from everything, so I headed to the mountains deep in the forests of Australia. I wanted a break from the city, from the noise, just me and nature. It started raining on and off as I drove, but I didn't mind. I liked the sound of rain hitting the roof of the car. I thought it would stop by the time I got to the campsite, but I was wrong. When I pulled into the clearing, the rain got heavier, drowning out all other sounds around me. The trees seemed to close in under the thick, gray sky. I hurried to set up my tent as it kept drizzling, trying to get everything inside before the rain picked up more. The sun was fading fast, and the clouds hung low, making it darker than it should have been. The air smelled fresh, but something didn't feel right. It was too quiet. Even with the rain, there were no birds, no animals, nothing. Just the sound of raindrops on the leaves and the ground, and my own footsteps as I moved around. By the time night came, the rain wasn't letting up. It poured down in waves, making the world outside my tent feel far away. I sat inside with a book, listening to the rain, but that strange feeling from earlier still lingered. Couldn't shake it. Something felt off, like I shouldn't be there. But I told myself it was just because I was alone, in the middle of nowhere. I tried to relax, telling myself I'd feel better after some sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was just the rain that woke me. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, I realized it wasn't that. The rain was still falling, but there was another sound mixed in. Something heavier. A faint, dull thudding sound, repeating slowly. It sounded like footsteps. I listened closely, my heartbeat quickening. I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a kangaroo hopping around in the trees, but the steps were too slow, too steady, too human, and they were getting closer. I sat up, trying to listen even harder. The steps stopped, and there was only the rain again. My heart raced, and I sat there waiting, but the sound didn't come back. I exhaled slowly, thinking maybe I was overreacting, but that uneasy feeling only grew. A little while later, I heard it again, this time much closer. Thud, thud, slow, heavy, and way too close. I froze, barely breathing. It sounded like someone was walking right outside my tent. The rain tapped lightly on the fabric of the tent, but I could clearly hear those footsteps now. My pulse pounded in my throat, and I stayed completely still, my mind racing. Who could possibly be out here? And why would they be walking around my camp in the middle of the night, during a storm? I waited, scared out of my mind, expecting to hear the zipper of my tent open any second. But nothing happened. The footsteps started moving again, slowly circling around the tent. I felt trapped. I didn't know whether to make a noise, to scare them away, or to stay as quiet as possible. But I couldn't move, frozen in place. The rain was the only sound again, steady and constant. Minutes passed, maybe even hours. Couldn't tell. The footsteps didn't come back, but the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening to the rain, waiting for something to happen. When morning finally came, the rain had stopped. Everything was wet and quiet. I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping out into the clearing. The ground was soaked, muddy, with wet leaves scattered everywhere. But what I noticed first were the tracks. Huge, deep footprints in the mud, circling my tent. They were way too big for any animal I knew of, and they followed a perfect path around my campsite. My heart sank. I looked around, feeling exposed in the daylight, like I was being watched. That's when I saw it. About 20 meters away, between two trees, there was a small open space that I hadn't noticed before. In the middle of it was a pile of rocks. Big, smooth stones stacked neatly on top of each other, like some kind of marker. I hadn't seen it when I arrived, and there's no way I could have missed it. Someone had been here, or maybe they still were. I didn't waste any time. I packed up fast, throwing everything into the car without folding anything neatly. I just wanted to get out. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that those footsteps weren't my imagination. Those stones, that pile, someone put them there for a reason. Maybe they wanted me to see it. Maybe they were waiting for me to make a mistake. As I left the mountain behind, a thought hit me, chilling me to the bone. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't make any noise when they left. The footsteps stopped, but they never walked away. They had been waiting, watching, moving around me all night, and I never knew how close they got. I never went back, and every time it rains, that feeling comes rushing back, like I'm still being watched, like I'm never truly alone. The sun was low in the sky when I pulled up to the campsite, the car shaking as I parked on the rough gravel. My ex-wife, Sarah, had suggested this trip, hoping it might heal some old wounds and give our kids a chance to reconnect with me. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach since we started planning this trip. As I unloaded the car, my two kids, Lucy and Max, jumped out of the back seat, their laughter ringing through the trees. The campsite was surrounded by thick woods, the trees standing tall like quiet watchers. It was a beautiful sight, but I couldn't shake the heavy feeling the dark forest gave me. After we set up the tent, we gathered around the fire pit, the warmth of the flames crackling and popping. I watched the kids roast marshmallows, their faces glowing with happiness. For a moment, everything felt perfect, but as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, a strange silence fell over us. When the kids went to bed, Sarah and I sat outside by the dying fire, the darkness swallowing up the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I heard rustling in the trees, a sound that sent a chill through me. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but deep down, I knew something was off. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, the tent feeling too hot and cramped. That's when I heard it. A faint but clear sound coming from outside, footsteps crunching on the leaves. My heart raced as I unzipped the tent quietly, trying not to wake the kids. The moon shone softly, lighting up the campsite, but the shadows seemed to move in strange ways. I stepped outside, squinting into the dark. My breath caught when I saw a figure standing just beyond the fire pit, partly hidden by the trees. The person looked like they were watching us. I wanted to shout, to wake Sarah and the kids, but no words came out. I moved slowly, trying to see better, but as I got closer, the figure vanished into the woods. Panic gripped me, and my mind raced. I rushed back to the tent, shaking Sarah awake, my voice filled with urgency. I couldn't find the words, so I just pointed toward the trees, my instincts screaming that we had to get out of there. We packed quickly, the kids still half asleep and confused. As we drove away, I looked back at the campsite, and a wave of cold fear washed over me. I felt like someone or something was still watching us from the edge of the woods. The tension hung thick in the air as we pulled onto the main road, the headlights cutting through the dark trees. I made a silent promise to never return. The trip had started with a bit of hope, but it ended with a terrifying realization. Sometimes, the past hides in the dark, and the woods hold secrets that are better left untouched. But as we drove further away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the road, watching us leave. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized that some things don't stay behind when you leave. They linger, waiting for the right moment to catch up. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees. It was a place that could hold onto your fears and bring them to life when you least expected it. I knew that whatever was out there was not done with us yet. I've always loved camping. As a firefighter, I felt at home in nature. One summer, I decided to take a solo trip to a remote spot deep in the woods, far away from the city noise. It was a quiet place, perfect for escaping everything. I packed my gear and drove out to the campsite, ready for a peaceful weekend. The first day went just as I hoped. I set up my tent next to a small lake, surrounded by tall trees. I spent the afternoon hiking, enjoying the fresh air and the sounds of the outdoors. As night fell, I built a campfire, feeling its warmth and the comforting light against the dark. I roasted some marshmallows and listened to the crackling fire, feeling content and relaxed. The second day started with more hiking, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The forest was oddly quiet. I was used to the sounds of birds and leaves rustling, but now it felt like the woods were holding their breath. I shook off the uneasy feeling, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As night approached, I returned to my campsite, but something didn't feel right. I could hear soft rustling in the bushes nearby. My firefighter instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight and looked around, but at first, I didn't see anything. I sat by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, but the feeling of being watched hung in the air. When I finally crawled into my tent, the rustling outside grew louder, and my heart started to race. I could hear branches snapping, as if something or someone was moving close by. I was all alone, and the silence felt heavy. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but deep down, I felt that this was different. Then I heard it. A low growl echoed through the trees, deep and threatening. It sent chills down my spine. I held my breath, hoping it would just go away. I grabbed my pocket knife, the only thing I had for protection, and tried to stay quiet, listening carefully. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by heavy footsteps that made my stomach drop. Panic shot through me. I slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something large moving between the trees. My instincts kicked in, telling me I had to leave. I hurriedly grabbed my gear, packing as quietly as I could. The footsteps grew louder, and the growl became more urgent. I stepped out of the tent, clutching my knife and flashlight, and dashed toward my car. I sprinted through the trees, my heart pounding, trying to ignore the sounds behind me. When I finally reached my truck, my hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside. I could hear the growling now, unmistakably close. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the engine over. As the headlights flickered to life, I caught a glimpse of it. A huge, dark shape standing among the trees, watching me with eyes that seemed to glow in the night. I hit the gas and tore out of the campsite, my heart racing as I drove away. The growl faded into the background, replaced by the sound of my heavy breathing and the pounding of my heart. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, relief washing over me. The woods looked beautiful during the day, but at night, they hid something I couldn't explain. That trip taught me a harsh lesson. Sometimes nature gives warnings for a reason. Not everything in the woods is friendly, and being alone can quickly turn into fear. I never went back to that campsite. The memory of that growl still haunts me, a chilling reminder of what lurks in the dark, waiting for the next camper who thinks they're safe. I learned that night that the quietest places can hide the most terrifying secrets, and sometimes, the things that hunt in the shadows are very real.